It is Odysseus's cunning that is his prime, as it's Achilles' speed and Agamemnon's lust and Ajax the bigger's strength and Ajax the minor's nastiness. They each have a sort of key feature, and Odysseus is the clever one, the cunning one.
Hello and welcome to the Aspects of History podcast. My name is Oliver Webb-Carter and I'm the editor and your host. Today we have one of the greatest stories of all time, the Trojan War. The epic struggle between Greece and Troy, and as you heard at the top there, featuring the great heroes Odysseus, Achilles, Ajax, Agamemnon, Menelaus, Hector, Paris, Priam, and also Helen, Clytemnestra, Penelope, Iphigenia, Hecuba and Cassandra. My guest is the author Peter Tonkin, who's written a trio of novels called the Wine Dark Sea trilogy, which is a wonderfully Homeric title. Of course, the Trojan War is known best because of Homer's The Iliad, so we talk about the great man and his work. We also talk the causes of war, its build-up, the types of weaponry and combat, and the aftermath, including how it's impacted the Tudor period and the modern day, with even Hollywood getting in on the act. Now, the Trojan horse, which I'm sure you all know about, was not actually covered by the surviving version of the Iliad. That part is missing, but we do have a Roman to thank for that part of the story, and I'm talking about Virgil, the famous plagiarist. Now, I know this pod is going to be popular with at least two people. Milo Jones, who got in touch with me to express his admiration for the Greeks and the Trojan War, and Hector Walker, named after the Trojan hero. So a big hello from me to you two. Coming up, I've got the Second World War with James Holland. It's the anniversary of the Great Retreat from Dunkirk, so Christopher Nolan's movie is The Film Club, which will be on Patreon. Links are in the show notes, check it out. For only a modest sum, you'll get plenty of content and extra bonus episodes. Please subscribe and tell your friends, but until then, I'll hand you over to me talking with Peter Tonkin and the Trojan War. Peter Tonkin, welcome on to the Aspects of History podcast. A real pleasure to have you on. It's great to have you on. It's been up and running in a while, and I should have got you on earlier, really. So that's bad of me not to have done that. But it is a pleasure because you are I think it's fair to say, a veteran writer. That's not insulting, is
it? No, it's very accurate.
Good, and you've written novels spanning, well, thrillers and,
yes,
and more recently historical novels.
That's right. Thrillers, spy stories, horror stories, and historical novels.
So a real pro. I think what your first novel, I think, was it Killer?
Yeah, well, that was my first majorly published novel, yes. Yeah, it's just being republished in America as a horror story.
It's a bit like Jaws, isn't it?
It is a precise rip-off of Jaws, yes.
You're very honest.
Yeah, well,
that did really well. But today we're going to be talking the Trojan War. It is very good of you to talk about this because your most recent trilogy is the Queen's Intelligencer series, which is a series set in Tudor England. So listeners, if you're interested in that, check that out. I'll obviously put links in the show notes. But we're going to talk Trojan War, and Peter's written this great trilogy, and where our hero is Odysseus. So what we're going to do talking about today is we're going to talk about the story of the Trojan War, and we'll mention a few interesting things coming out of Peter's novel. But let's kick off for listeners who might not be, they might be aware of the Iliad, but not know what period of history we're talking about, and really how the war started as well.
Okay. Right. Well, it depends whether you're talking history or legend. Historically, you're looking at the late Bronze Age, which is before writing was invented, before money was invented, before iron was widely used. It might have been invented in India, but it hadn't hit the Mediterranean yet. And that period in Greek history and prehistory, really, And across the other side of the Aegean Sea, which was named after Aegeus, who drowned in it, was enjoying a high point of civilization. There was wide trade routes. There were several major, civilizations all together. There were the Greeks. This is long before they called themselves Greeks. They were Achaeans. And there were the Egyptians to the south. There were the Hittites to the east. Those were the three great civilizations in that area at that time. And they traded, they communicated, they seemed to have got on well. It's not generally recognized, I don't think, that the cities on the coast of the eastern side of the Aegean were strongly influenced by the Hittites, who were a much more Middle Eastern society. So, for instance, the leaders of the Achaeans, Agamemnon, Odysseus, Menelaus, they all had one wife, and they all begat a limited number of children. But in Ilion, or Wilusa, or Troy, the three civilizations gave it each a different name, was very much more a Middle Eastern organization. So Priam, the king of Ilion or Troy, was in fact blessed with a harem, and Hecuba was only his senior wife. His eldest son was Hector, and his youngest son was Paris, but he had 48 other sons in between. So he obviously had a well-established line of succession, which the Achaeans didn't to anything like the same degree. And so they were taking much greater risk in attacking Ilion, as they eventually did. According to legend, well, first you've got to understand that what we know of the situation comes from two books, basically the Iliad and the Odyssey, both by a bloke that succeeding generations have christened Homer, though we don't know if he was real, and we don't know whether he made up elements of the story or was just the first person to write down an oral history. But those two are part of an 8-book cycle, which is called the Epic Cycle, which in fact tells the entire story. Unfortunately, most of the other 6 books are lost. So there's a book about the start of the war, a book about the main attack, which is the Iliad as we know it. Then there's the story. It's very much, for the whole of that area, it's very much like the period immediately following when the Romans left Britain in sort of like 400 AD, and suddenly a civilization that had built great structures and organized great cities and things vanished entirely, and were replaced by people who had no concept of how this was achieved, other than to imagine it was done by gods, etc., which is very much like the Saxons reacted to what they found when they arrived in southern England after the Romans had gone.
So it's a sort of dark ages.
Yes.
And so the story that we read about is really, this is in your novels as well, is Paris pops over to Sparta from Troy, doesn't he?
It starts with the gods.
You've made a decision. Sorry to interrupt you, Peter.
No, that's okay.
Tell me to shut up if I keep on interrupting you.
Okay.
But you made a decision, because the gods make up a huge part of the Iliad, but you made a decision, much like the film Troy, which we will get onto, not to have any gods in it.
Yes. I just wanted to write as basically as close as I could get to a historical thriller or several historical thrillers. The gods are, to a certain extent, a cop-out. They personify particular weaknesses, drives, lusts, etc. in the protagonists. And so people who do bad things are, to a certain extent, excused by saying, well, no, it wasn't me, the gods made me do it. The most terrible, to my mind, instance of this is when Achilles kills the queen of the Amazons, Penthesilea, in one-to-one combat under the walls of Troy. And as she dies, Athena makes him fall helplessly and completely in love with her. And so he ravishes her there and then, and, as a corpse. And of course, it's not Achilles' fault. Achilles is a really nice bloke, really, but the gods made him do it. And and that's where it all starts, with the three leading goddesses having a fight over who is the most beautiful. And they decide that what they'll do is they'll get somebody to judge between them. And they find Paris, who is the youngest son of Priam, king of Troy. And Paris, as is often the case in legends, is not at home like a good sensible bloke would be. He's out on the mountainside looking after the sheep, and they think he's nice, he's sensible, he'll give them a good result. And so the three goddesses parade themselves in front of him in various states of undress and promise him various rewards if he votes for them. Okay, and that's a very interesting concept, given that it's local elections day today, and politicians are doing almost identically the same thing, but probably wearing a few more clothes. But that being said, it's Venus in the Roman art who gives Paris the irresistible prize. If Aphrodite, yes. If you choose me, I will give you as your own toy and plaything the most beautiful woman alive. And Paris is, he's in his late teens. That's all he thinks about. So he says, yeah, fine, I'll go for that. The only problem is the most beautiful woman alive is married, and she's married to Agamemnon's brother, Menelaus, who is the king of Sparta. So Paris attaches himself to it's more than just a diplomatic mission. It's a trade mission. It's fairly standard. And he attaches himself to that, and he goes to Sparta, and he seduces Helen, who again is, to a certain extent, a puppet of the gods and goddesses, because she actually is in love with Menelaus. And in the end of everything, spoiler alert, she actually goes back to Menelaus, settles down with him, and lives out a very happy old age. They just sort of nag each other like old married people do. But she has this purple period in the middle where she is taken off with Paris, and he takes her to Troy. So Menelaus goes to his big brother Agamemnon, and things are complicated a little then by the fact that Agamemnon is the Vladimir Putin of his era, and he sees his brother as a really, really good excuse to invade the Ukraine. But in Agamemnon's case, it's Troy. Troy is an enormously rich trading position. It's just on the coast of the Dardanelles, the eastern coast of the Dardanelles. So you've got all the Black Sea coming, you've got all the stuff coming in from the empires right the way back to China. You've got from Egypt, from the land of Punt, which nobody knows where it is, but it was massively, massively rich coming up. And then from Achaia and the Western Mediterranean, all centered. They traded in horses, famously, but they also traded in copper and tin, which are the two things you need to make bronze. And so it's an enormously rich city, which legend suggests had already been ravaged at least once in recent history by Hercules and his mates, who jumped ship from Jason and the Argo. They never made it as far as Colchis and the Golden Fleece. They jumped ship round about Troy, and they went and they sacked Troy. Hercules, in fact, killed Priam's father because he welched on them. There was this lion which was decimating the herds, and Priam's father promised Hercules that if he got rid of the lion, he'd give him all this gold. Hercules got rid of the lion, and the king said, "Oh no, when I said gold, I didn't really mean it. You're only a sort of passing pirate, so just sod off." And Hercules got a bit grumpy about that and killed him, and destroyed some of the walls and a section of the Scaean gates.
This is the wonderful thing about the heroes of this era. Sorry to interrupt you again, Peter. This era is all these heroes that maybe many listeners have heard of and have read about stories of. But when you look into it in a little bit more detail, a lot of these heroes are awful people, aren't they?
Yes, they are. All of them, actually, with hardly any exceptions. In my books, I've tried to make Achilles a sort of honourable person. We haven't got to the Penthesilea episode yet, but my central character, Odysseus, he's a coward to a certain extent. He pretends to be insane in order to avoid going to the war in the first place. And it's only when one of Agamemnon's mates chucks Telemachus, his baby son, in front of a plough that he's behaving insanely with, that he actually stops and does the sensible thing and proves that he's not mad. And the bloke who did that, he spends the rest of the Odyssey trying to stab him in the back. And in the end, he arranges for him to be murdered. You get when Achilles dies, there are games at his funeral, and there's a competition to win his armor. And Odysseus wins the armor against Ajax the Big. There are two Ajaxes, Ajax the Big and Ajax the Small. And he wins against Ajax the Big, who is so angered by this that he kills himself, as you would. He's been at war.
It's a very fancy piece of art, piece of kit, isn't it? It's very bling. Yes. It's very bling, and
well, Hephaestus made the shield, and a lot of the art. Yes, it's worth killing for, but I don't think it's worth dying over.
No.
But I've just done a short story where one of the characters is Cassandra, who has a habit of saying nobody ever listens to me, because she was given the skill of prophecy by the gods, by one god, but then another god decided that she would never be believed. So once again, Cassandra is one of these sort of god-governed characters. And at the fall of Troy, because she is a daughter of Priam, she's the last one of Priam's house to live, she's in the temple of Artemis. And Ajax the Lesser takes her and rapes her in the temple. And Athena is so angry about this that she arranges for Ajax the Lesser to drown on his way home. Though Agamemnon takes Cassandra as his last bed slave. And then he's really, really, really surprised when he gets home to find that his wife Clytemnestra kills him.
Yes. Now, so Paris and Helen fall in love in Sparta on this sort of, we call it a trade. Fall in love, fall in lust, or whatever.
Well,
trade mission.
Right.
And he ships her back to Troy. Now, Agamemnon, as you say, he's Putin in this scenario.
Yeah.
And so he rounds up this huge army, doesn't he?
Yeah, 1,000 ships. Is this the face that launched 1,000 ships? Yeah, Marlowe,
Marlowe, yes, Christopher Marlowe.
Yeah, somebody else I write about. But yes, But you see, there's no practicality to it. That's how I really, really enjoy looking at the practicality. So you've got an army that takes 1,000 ships to move, and you've got a 10-year war. And how was it supplied? You know, where did they get their food from? Where did they get their new horses from? Where did they get more armor? Where did they get more spears? Where did they get more swords? There must have been fleet after fleet after fleet coming out of Achaia, coming across the Aegean and supplying them. And the tradespeople in Greece must have really cleaned up, but at the same time, the governing class is getting wiped out. And so at the end of 10 years, you end up with very few kings left, almost no leaders, no armies much, not one but possibly two generations of senior people wiped out. It's a bit like the First World War, only the difference is instead of the Spanish flu arriving, these people called the sea people arrived. And they obviously had found out that there was a great deal of wealth in the place, and there was nobody there to protect it. And suddenly the sea people just sweep through from about 1200 BCE, and everything shuts down. Even the Egyptians, well, we only know about the sea people really because of the Egyptians. They recorded their arrival and described them to some extent. And of course, well, the Hittites had writing. The Achaeans didn't really. They were still largely, an oral society, though they were using writing to record things as you would, how many slaves, how many horses, how many bales of linen, etc., etc. But there was very few writing as a way of communicating, though the Hittites did do that, and their kings wrote to each other, and at least one Hittite king wrote to an Achaean king. So we assume that the Achaean king either probably had somebody, a Hittite slave or something like that, who could read it to him. But it's trying to imagine how that society worked, because they didn't have writing, they didn't have money. It was, largely barter. The first thing you did when you killed someone was strip their armor, because their armor was worth a lot. And everything else was how many goats was she worth, and how many, it's like when you go to Egypt, the first thing the locals say, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, your wife there, she's worth about 3 camels, mate. How are you? What are you doing? Fortunately, mine was worth a good number more than 3.
I'll make sure I don't go to Egypt. And you mentioned it's probably, I don't know. Have you been to ancient Mycenae archaeological sites?
No, I haven't been to either of the sites. Not to Troy and not to Mycenae, but
I would recommend the listeners. It's extraordinary.
Yeah, must do that.
Well, you mentioned Agamemnon there, and he really is the villain of the story. And I guess whilst now is as good a time as any to just mention that Hollywood did have a crack at the Trojan War, and I watched the film, and I watched it again recently, and first time I saw it, I was very upset. I did stay seated throughout the entire film, but one thing I would say that has aged well is I think the casting is excellent. So yes, Agamemnon, who is played by Brian Cox, is basically the ancient world's Logan Roy. Yes, and but then you have many other. Brad Pitt is of course Achilles. Odysseus is played by Sean Bean. And when I was a child reading these stories growing up, these are the kind of, obviously these actors weren't in my mind, but when they cast these actors in their roles, they kind of fitted in quite well with what I had read. But Agamemnon is definitely the bad guy here, and one of I think is it the second story, Vengeance at Aulis, which is when Agamemnon probably commits his most grievous crime.
He does. He obviously That's where his wife's genuine hatred of him begins, and where at least part of the problem Achilles has with him begins as well. Because again, the goddesses in this case, cause problems. There is above Aulis a wooded area which is dedicated to the goddess Athena. And
Aulis is right on the coast of Boeotia near Euboea or Evia, is it's now called.
Yeah, it's on the.
It's sort of in the middle.
There's that great big island that was on fire for most of last summer. And but Aulis is across the bay from that.
On the mainland.
On the mainland. And it actually does have a huge open harbour. So there would have been anchorage for a fair number of boats there. In the hills above it, as I say, there were these groves that were sacred, and particularly the deer in those groves were sacred. And Agamemnon, bored with the wind against him, not everyone bored, got an army ready to go. And as most people, it's not just Othello, but most people in command situations discover that if you've got a battle-ready army and you don't put them in battle, then it just makes trouble. And
yes, Gordon Corrigan was saying the same thing about the Battle of Crécy thousands of years later.
Yeah. So upshot of that is that Agamemnon gets bored as well, and he goes hunting, and he kills a sacred deer. And the wind then strengthens against him, and everyone in his command is caught on this lee shore. Nobody's going anywhere. And the priestess explains to him that the only way to get the wind to turn is to sacrifice to the goddess the equivalent of the deer of hers that he killed. And he says, okay, well, what has the goddess got in mind? And she tells him, well, one of your kids. And so his eldest daughter, Iphigenia, is 13, 14, old enough to be touted out for marriage. So he sends a message by a messenger, not writing, not a letter, messenger, to Mycenae, and tells Clytemnestra, who is Helen's sister, and only a whisker less beautiful, and therefore deeply peeved that Helen has been named as the most beautiful woman alive. So she's peeved in the first place, that he tells Clytemnestra that Achilles has fallen madly in love with Iphigenia and wants to marry her. And so Clytemnestra brings the girl to Aulis, and she, being a direct sort of person, goes straight to Achilles and says, right, okay, where's the wedding? And Achilles knows nothing about what she's talking about. And the pair of them get really angry with each other. And then they work out that Agamemnon's had something to do with this. So they both get really, really angry with Agamemnon. But that's as nothing compared to how angry they get when he suddenly announces that he's got Iphigenia here in order to sacrifice her. And they try and stop him. In fact, Achilles threatens to kill him if he does it, but he does it anyway. And Achilles doesn't kill him, because as soon as the girl is dead, mind you, in various iterations of this story, just as the knife is coming down, there is a big flash of lightning, and Iphigenia is whisked away to somewhere much more pleasant, and a deer appears in her place on the altar, much like the story of Abraham and Isaac in the Bible, where Abraham is going to sacrifice Isaac, only a sheep turns up at the last moment. More about Abraham and Isaac in a minute, actually. But that being said, I'm not having gods in my stories, so poor old Iphigenia gets the knife, and the wind changes immediately. And so everyone just piles on board their boats and off they go, except for Clytemnestra, who has to bury the girl and then go home to her other kids, and Agamemnon's cousin, who's young and willing and handsome. And God, she's got to wait 10 years. So, there's going to be trouble there.
Yes. Trouble to come there. So when the fighting itself at Troy, which, as we've mentioned, lasts 10 years, and there are these sort of great heroes. In fact, if there is one good guy on either side, it's probably Hector, isn't it? And he leads the defense. Now, I have to give a shout out because I won't be forgiven otherwise. My nephew is called Hector,
right?
And so he leads the fight against the Greeks. But what the warfare is not quite the same warfare as we see in, say, for example, the Greco-Persian Wars. It's slightly different, isn't it? It
is. Well, to begin with, there's a complete set of stories that happen on the way to Troy. According to the first story, the Cypria, Agamemnon's fleet sails to Troy, doesn't get there, does some sort of burning, raping and pillaging down the coast further, then comes back to Aulis and then goes back again. So there's a whole lot of stuff happens before they get to Troy. And in actual fact, all three of my books are set before they get to Troy. But you're right. The only one, possibly because he dies before he gets the chance to do anything too terrible, is Hector. He seems to be a straight up and down guy. He is a noted tamer of horses, which is, in the circumstances of the stories, a really, really high compliment. Question about whether or not they rode horses to battle, almost certainly not. It's not until the time of Belisarius in the 2nd century AD that the Western civilizations discover the stirrup. None of the high Roman cavalry had stirrups at all. According to Conington, it's the Khan, Genghis Khan, and the hordes that invent the stirrup, which makes the horse a good platform to fire from, and so you get proper cavalry. But what they did have was they had these chariots that were drawn by 1 or 2 horses, probably not more than 2. But the chariots were not like Ben-Hur's chariot, rather Messala's chariot. They weren't themselves weapons of war. Basically, you got on your chariot with your shield and your spears and your sword, and you had your chariot driver drive your chariot into the battlefield, and you jumped out, and then you stood on foot and you fought. You might throw your spear from your chariot, but you wouldn't throw all of your spears from your chariot, because when you were fighting, your spear was your principal weapon, not your sword. Which is logical when you think about it, because we're talking bronze, which is hard, but it's not, hard. A bronze sword will hold an edge, but only for so long. However, a strong spear point, will stay sharp enough and have penetrative power. We're not talking everyone being in armor of gold. Most people would have been in, if they were in armor, they'd have been in cowhide, strengthened or thickened, hardened in various ways. And you can get a bronze spear point through cowhide armor easily. Shields, again, were probably hide. We haven't got anything from that period in the British Museum, but there is an interesting later piece of armor in there from nearer Cleopatra's time. And it's a piece of armor made out of crocodile skin. And it's black armor, really awesome looking stuff. But armor, thickened, strengthened hide wood, slats of wood, tight packed reeds, all of which would be pretty well pierced by a well wielded spear point. And of course, even though the helmets had face coverings, as the opening to the film of Troy showed, unless you were guarding also the tops of your shoulders and your throat, then your armor was basically useless. I must admit, I do very much like the opening section of Troy, which establishes Achilles' great strength was his speed. And that opening section where he has to fight Boreas, the huge giant, and he runs up to him and jumps up and sticks his sword in the side of his neck, just where it joins the shoulder, and is gone before the guy knows he's even dead, is a very interesting construction of the way that, or reconstruction of the way that Homer says he used to fight.
And there were quite a few one-to-one battles, fights rather, and probably the most famous of all is Menelaus fighting, the cuckold Menelaus fighting Paris, the man who's, started this trouble.
Yes. In the film, obviously, and you can see why, Paris chickens out and Hector has to protect him.
It's well cast because it's Orlando Bloom, who's very handsome and everything, but is slightly weedy, certainly compared to Brendan Gleeson, the great Irish actor who plays Menelaus, who no one wants to
the house. That's true. That's true. But in the book, Athena rescues him. When Menelaus is just about to kill him, there's this big flash, and the next thing Paris knows, he's back in his bedroom. So, and again, it's the gods and goddesses interfering. And when they made the decision not to have gods and goddesses in the film, they had to motivate people differently. And they had to take, obviously, the requirement. The problem with the film, from a purist's point of view, is that it does depart from the Iliad towards the end. Because
I have a lot of sympathy for I think when I watched the film, I didn't at the time. I think I remember hearing Brad Pitt being interviewed saying something like, well, if Homer was around today, he'd say, lose the gods. Which I think irritated my youth. Had just graduated from university, so I was probably a bit pretentious. But actually, looking back now, it's probably a good move in that film not to have the gods.
Well, you see, you've got parallels, haven't you, of things like Clash of the Titans, either the original with Laurence Olivier and co, or the more modern one with what's his name? Liam Neeson, where the gods do take part. The absolutely wonderful Jason and the Argonauts with those animated skeletons, which are still creepy as hell, that Ray Harryhausen did. Yes, it makes the people puppets. They're not characters, they're puppets. And to a certain extent, that's apt because, of course, they're puppets in the literature. They don't have control over themselves. They don't have motivation in the same way as we understand it. And looking back at the film and the architecture of the narrative that they have to put in there, you can't have Achilles killed by Paris and then another few years going by before the wooden horse arrives. You've got to have it all tied up at the end. You really have to. And it is effective. I think it's effective. They make Achilles honorable. He gets shot by Paris trying to protect Briseis. He does not ravish Briseis. He leaves that to Agamemnon. And he only comes out of his tent when, what's his name?
Patroclus.
Gets killed by mistake by Hector because he's wearing Achilles' armor. They've got all of that set up. Achilles is seems quite petty in the Iliad to a certain extent because he is sulking in his tent. He is refusing to take part in the battle. because Agamemnon has taken Briseis. That seems petty to us or to a modern audience. But of course, in that time, given that it was a fairly fictional time that Homer's writing about, everything was reputation. You stood or fell by what people thought of you. And Achilles could not be a hero if he was just going to shrug off the fact that people were taking away his righteous spoils of war, because that's what he's there for.
In Achilles' showdown with Hector.
Yes.
I'm slightly forgetting, it's been a while, but when Hector fights Achilles, isn't there godly intervention and he starts running around the walls of Troy?
Runs around 7 times, pursued by Achilles, but not in the movie. So that is correct. And he knows he's beaten. That's why he runs. Before anyone lays a stroke. There is the film and the sort of historical situation are interestingly parallel in that Agamemnon can't actually get his army together until he gets Achilles on side. And they couldn't actually get the finance for the film together until Brad Pitt said he would play Achilles. So there's a perfect parallel there, I think, and quite a telling one. It's the importance of the central character, the star. You need a star.
Yes, you certainly do. It's where most of on our film club been learning how most of the finance, the money spent on a film goes on the stars.
Yes, no, absolutely. But if they are what makes the film happen, that's that is to a certain extent money well spent.
Because we're running out of time, Peter. So let's talk about we've seen Achilles. Okay, many heroes fall.
Yes,
and then we get to the conclusion, and this is it where Odysseus really does come through as one of the great heroes, doesn't he?
Yes. Well, he is cunning Odysseus all the way through. He's got red hair. He's got blue-green eyes. He's a sailor.
He's Sean Bean. I thought he made a great Odysseus.
No, he did. I'm not saying he didn't. No, he is. And he's got that sort of, or he did at that time, have that sort of intelligence, though he's played sort of weaker characters since. I saw his Macbeth, which was really quite interesting, and he came across very strong and calculating in Macbeth. He came off the stage very well. It is Odysseus's cunning that is his prime, as it's Achilles' speed and Agamemnon's lust, and Ajax the bigger's strength and Ajax the minor's, just nastiness. They each have a sort of key feature, and Odysseus is the clever one, the cunning one. They're not quite so sure about him, though, in the texts. They see cunning as being a lesser virtue than heroism.
And in the Sophocles play Philoctetes, Odysseus is downright manipulative and rather a base character. And
Shakespeare does the same in Troilus and Cressida. It's Troilus and Cressida. Achilles and Odysseus are really quite a nasty bunch. They're professional soldiers. Shakespeare's quite close to Pat Barker in his analysis of these guys, but we don't know. We know that Shakespeare understands, because as I said in Othello, most of the mischief that's done is done because he's got an army that he's been told to sit on Malta and sit on his hands, and of course they get up to mischief because they're not doing anything, and Shakespeare understands that pretty well. And so, he understands the common soldiers. It's the common soldiers through Henry IV and Henry V, etc., that underpin the great leaders. And you don't know. You've got the lost years, you've got the missing years. Some people think he was a tutor in a Catholic household. In my Tudor books, he's been on the edge of the army, working for the Earl of Leicester as a code breaker, because of course his plays are full of codes and double meanings and hidden messages, etc., etc. So that seemed sensible enough. Even now, if you go online, there's a whole lot of stuff about Shakespeare being involved in underhanded dealings and that sort of thing. I mean, I'm halfway through Dominic Green's The Double Life of Dr. Lopez at the moment, and he ties almost everything back to Shakespeare. That Shakespeare learned this, Shakespeare did that, Shakespeare.
So back to Troy. We're getting Odysseus steps forward. Everyone knows this story, I assume,
of the wooden horse.
I think what might be more interesting is to learn what happened after the horse came in and Agamemnon blots.
Well, Agamemnon does not go in the horse. Achilles is dead, so other people go in the horse. Ajax, big Ajax, little Ajax, Odysseus is in there. Achilles' son is in there. They're pulled through. The horse is sacred to Poseidon, and the Trojans are very aware of Poseidon. They live in Turkey, modern Turkey, not far from a fault line. And they've already had several earthquakes which have damaged the walls of Troy. And earthquakes are, by general recognition, caused by Poseidon. And the horse is sacred to Poseidon. And so they take the horse in on the assumption it's an offering to Poseidon from the Greeks, so that he will give them a safe voyage home. But at the same time, they're happy to accept it because Poseidon is the one who can do their city most damage. But then, of course, the Greeks drop out of the belly of the horse. They open the Scaean gates. The Greek army, now led by Agamemnon, come in and they kill everyone, the ones that they ravish. And so, you go back to that great speech in Hamlet that Charlton Heston delivers so brilliantly in Kenneth Branagh's version, Hecuba, the moblid queen, and Hamlet's great line afterwards, what's Hecuba to him, or he to Hecuba, that he should cry for her. Yeah, they all die. One or two. Aeneas is supposed to get away and go and found Rome, which is the Virgil's Aeneid. Briseis has committed suicide by that time, so Agamemnon is lonely between the sheets. Not that they may have invented sheets, actually. They were pretty good with their linen. But so he's taken Cassandra, and he takes Cassandra home, and Clytemnestra drowns him in his bath and then kills Cassandra with an axe.
If you go to Mycenae, there is a room which archaeologists, I think, are having a little bit of fun, claim is the bath that Agamemnon is in, where it happens.
Hey. But yes, that's it.
I mean, you've just educated us really about how important this story is for the Tudor period with Shakespeare's writing. What do you think the Trojan War tells us about today? I mean, people are still fascinated by it, aren't they?
It's still incredibly influential in almost every way. Since I left university, I've been sort of kicking around the idea that maybe I should do a PhD on the theory of narrative. And of course, when you look at narrative, the place you start really is Eric Auerbach's Mimesis. A chapter in Mimesis is called Odysseus's Scar. And in that first chapter, he takes two of the earliest pieces of writing in the Western civilization and compares them. And one is the biblical story of Abraham sacrificing Isaac that we mentioned earlier, where he puts the boy on the altar and is about to kill him when he sees a ram, because God has put a ram there, and he sacrifices the ram instead. And he balances against that the moment at which Odysseus comes home, this way-worn, dusty beggar, all on his own because he's managed to get his entire crew killed. And he's welcomed in by Penelope, who tells her maidservant to give him something to eat, this old bloke, and wash his feet because they're all dusty and covered. And she's washing his feet when she sees the scar on his thigh and realizes who it is. And in one of those, you get no background at all. You get Abraham is told to go to this place by God. He goes. He's told to take Isaac with him. He takes Isaac. You don't know anything about them. You don't know anything about any, and it just goes straight in. Okay. But then compared with that, you get the old lady, where she, why she's got the bowl, what happens when she recognizes Odysseus, and then Homer stops and goes into a background as to how Odysseus got the scar in the first place. And it's the first use of a flashback in Western literature. And the two ways of telling stories are completely different, and yet both enormously influential. And so even now in narrative theory, the Trojan War and the stories about the Trojan War are still, front and center. They're really, really, really important.
It's great stuff, Peter. Thank you. And it's really interesting hearing about the Tudor interpretation of it as well. So the trilogy, the Wine Dark trilogy,
the Wine Dark Sea, yeah,
Wine Dark Sea, which wonderful Homeric line about the Aegean, isn't it?
It is, yes.
And any visitors to Greece will be familiar with what the waters of the Aegean and indeed the Ionian Sea look like.
Yes.
Thank you so much for coming on. It's been a real pleasure. Always great hearing about the Homeric epics.
Okay.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed that. Please share, rate and review if you can. Plenty more content to come, including the Second World War, and the film club continues with Christopher Nolan's Dunkirk. Do check out the Patreon. Links are in the show notes. Until then, thank you and good night.